In 1993, a respected attorney vanished during a high-profile trial in California. For years, there were no clues until 3 boys stumbled on his wallet deep in the woods. What followed was a trail of encrypted messages, dead witnesses, and one final sighting that changed everything. This is the story of Thomas Weller and the secret he may have died to protect. It was a cloudy afternoon in San Rafael, California, in September 1993. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and exhaust, the kind of day where shadows stretched longer than they should and everything felt a bit off. Outside the Marin County Superior Court, Shats were packing up their gear, still buzzing from the morning's court session where Thomas Weller, one of the most well-known attorneys in Northern California, had delivered a scathing accusation against the real estate conglomerate Westridge Holdings. Thomas was no stranger to controversy, but this case felt different. Bigger, personal almost. He had made enemies before, but not like this. Not the kind of enemies who sent threats by certified mail or stared him down in parking garages. He had brushed them off, of course. He always did. At 4:16 p.m., Thomas was last seen leaving the courthouse through the east lobby. A security guard nodded at him, recalling later that he looked tense but focused, holding a thin leather briefcase in one hand, car keys in the other. Thomas didn't stop to talk to anyone. He didn't glance at the journalists still lingering at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He simply walked to the elevator and vanished into routine. When his wife, Irene Weller, hadn't heard from him by 7:00 p.m., she wasn't yet panicked. Thomas often came home late, especially when reviewing case files or meeting confidential sources. But by 9:30 p.m., her calls were going to voicemail, and by midnight she had called his assistant, his office, even the courthouse janitorial department. No one had seen him. No one had heard anything. The next morning, police located his car in the courthouse garage, a silver 1992 Lexus L400, pristine and parked in his usual spot. The doors were locked. Inside, his briefcase untouched on the passenger seat, his wallet in the center console, his watch neatly resting on the dashboard. The keys were missing, but nothing else suggested a struggle or a departure. Detective Ray Hanlon of the San Rafael Police Department was the first to step into the vehicle. It was like stepping into a still life, he would later tell reporters. No fingerprints beyond his, no signs of forced entry, just silence. What stood out most wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. Thomas's pager, always clipped to his belt, was not inside. Nor was his personal notebook, a leather-bound journal he took everywhere, even to Sunday brunch. The disappearance baffled law enforcement. Security footage showed him walking through the parking garage entryway, but never reaching his car. The next camera, just 10 yards away, should have captured him. But it didn't. The feed cut out for exactly 6 minutes. When it resumed, the frame was empty. The Weller family issued a public plea 3 days later. Irene, composed but clearly shaken, stood beside a cluster of microphones and begged, "If you know where my husband is, please, just let him come home. He didn't deserve this. None of us do." The press latched onto every theory. He faked his own disappearances. He was silenced by Westridge Holdings. He ran away with a mistress, but no money was withdrawn from any of his accounts. No passports were flagged. No flights were taken. It was as if Thomas Weller had been erased from the face of the earth. Colleagues painted a picture of a man under stress, but not broken. He believed in the law, maybe to a fault, said his partner, Gregory Finch. Thomas wasn't the kind of guy to vanish without a reason, but if he did, there must have been one hell of a reason. Days turned into weeks. Tips flooded the police line, sightings in San Diego, then Reno, then even as far as Mexico City. None of them panned out. Westridge Holdings released a statement denying any involvement and offered their deepest sympathies to the Weller family. But behind closed doors, whispers spread like wildfire. One reporter for the Marin Times, Elaine Griggs, began digging into Westridge's finances and noticed a pattern of settlements, quiet payouts, sealed documents, non-disclosure agreements. Her editor shut the story down within days, and then silence settled. No ransom note, no communication, no explanation. For Irene, time became liquid, moments folding into each other, grief crystallizing into questions with no answers. Every birthday, every anniversary, every knock at the door was laced with the desperate hope that he'd return. But he'd returned. Not then. 7 days had passed since Thomas Weller vanished, and his absence was beginning to metastasize into something darker than confusion. The press had grown quiet, the initial frenzy dissolving into muttered theories and back-page headlights. For Irene Weller, silence had never screamed louder. She sat alone at their oak kitchen table, the morning sun casting a lattice of light across the checkered floor. Her hands shook as she opened the mail, expecting bills or condolence cards. Instead, she found a plain manila envelope without return address. The handwriting on it was crisp and deliberate, her name penned in a style unfamiliar to her. Inside, she found copies faded but legible of legal documents tied to Thomas's last case. Depositions, motions, evidentiary attachments. At first, she didn't grasp their significance, but then her eyes fell on the red markings, 3 separate sections, each underlined in red pen, annotated in the margins with short phrases like "Follow Money Trail," "Client 52BM Anomaly," and, disturbingly, "They knew." Her breath caught. These were not his notes. She contacted Detective Hanlon immediately. Within an hour, officers were scanning the envelope for fingerprints, lifting it with tweezers like it held poison. They asked where she found it, how it had been delivered, but Irene swore there was no postal stamp. It had simply appeared, placed, perhaps slid beneath the door while she was asleep. That same afternoon, police expanded the search beyond the garage. They revisited Thomas's office downtown, this time with a digital forensic unit. That's when they uncovered something chilling. Thomas's work computer, which had sat undisturbed since the morning of his disappearance, had been wiped clean at exactly 11:42 p.m. the night he vanished. Not reformatted, not corrupted, scrubbed remotely via a backdoor software no one admitted installing. Only one person had full administrator access: Thomas. His assistant, Claire, swore she never touched the terminal. His firm's IT consultant insisted no remote control protocols had ever been installed. Yet the logs didn't lie somewhere, had accessed the system through a ghost connection and destroyed everything, down to the recycle bin contents. It wasn't just suspicious, it was surgical, deliberate. Harland felt the weight of it then. What had begun as a missing persons case was tilting toward conspiracy. A man with motive, secrets, and high-powered enemies had not simply gone AWOL. He'd been intercepted, possibly silenced, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. 2 days later, Erland found herself unable to sleep. She wandered through their house in her robe, trailing her fingers along the bookshelves and picture frames. She ended up in Thomas's study, a room she had been too afraid to enter. His scent lingered faintly, something between leather and old cologne. She sat at his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and found a small black notebook with his initials embossed on the cover. But when she opened it, every page had been torn out. The spine was intact, but the content was gone, as if he'd known someone would come looking. She called Claire the next morning, asking if Thomas had mentioned anything unusual before he vanished. Claire hesitated, then said, "There was one thing. He'd been receiving phone calls. Unlisted numbers. He'd hang up quickly or step out to answer them. I once overheard him say, 'It's bigger than we thought.' When I asked what he meant, he said it was just client paranoia." But he looked. That same week, an anonymous letter arrived at the police department. Inside was a single sentence typed in block letters. He knew too much. There were no fingerprints, no return address, nothing that could be traced. But the envelope contained something else. A parking stub from the night Thomas vanished. It was time-stamped 8:37 p.m., 3 hours after he was seen leaving the courthouse, from a garage 6 blocks away. Detective Hanlon retrieved the security footage from that garage. At precisely 8:37 p.m., a man resembling Thomas could be seen stepping out of a dark sedan, wearing the same jacket he'd worn to court. But the footage was grainy, and the man never looked up. Still, the resemblance was close enough to act, recorded for someone else's benefit. Forensics on the envelope with the stub returned one partial fingerprint, too smudged for a match, but enough to confirm human handling. The FBI was quietly notified. Not officially, just a tap on the shoulder from a friend in the bureau who owed Hanlon a favor. The moment federal jurisdiction entered the air, things shifted. Requests for cooperation were returned with silence. Files began to go missing from Hanlon's archive. One of his junior officers reported his apartment had been broken into, though nothing was stolen, just rearranged. Meanwhile, Ahrens began compiling everything, every note, every strange occurrence, into a binder. She kept it beside her bed, beneath a floorboard she reinstalled herself. She wasn't paranoid, not yet, but she knew the difference between coincidence and pattern. And this was starting to feel like a noose tightening. One evening, while reviewing the copies of Thomas's final court documents, she noticed something that had escaped her before. In the lower corner of one marked page, barely visible beneath the red ink, was a scribbled name: Leon Vega. She didn't recognize it. Neither did Claire. But when Hanlon ran it through a public records search, the name was attached to a man who had testified in a Westridge Holdings lawsuit back in 1985 and disappeared 3 weeks later. When Hanlon brought that name to his superior, he was told to drop it. Too old. Not relevant. "You're chasing shadows," they said. But Hanlon didn't believe in shadows. He believed in evidence. And now the evidence was pointing toward something buried long ago, a chain of disappearances, erased identities. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that someone had taken Thomas to keep him quiet, or that Thomas had known all along this was going to happen. Maybe that's why he left the clues. Maybe the red marks, the names scrawled on the document, the erased computer, were never mistakes. Maybe they were breadcrumbs left by a man who saw the trap closing and tried, in his final moments of freedom, to leave a path. 6 months had slipped by since Thomas Weller's disappearance, and what once rattled a community had now settled into an uncomfortable silence. The press had moved on, the headlines buried under fresher tragedies. Irene Weller still walked the same cold floors, still whispered his name into her morning coffee, but now her grief wore the mask of acceptance, brittle and tired. Detective Hanlon, meanwhile, was quietly being pushed to close the case. Higher-ups had reclassified it from active investigation to pending leads, bureaucratic code for forgotten. But Hanlon wasn't ready to quit, not yet. He wasn't the only one. Walt Durning was a retired cop turned private investigator, a man with a worn leather coat and eyes that had seen too much. He'd taken interest in the Weller case partly because of the money, retainers from Irene's brother, but mostly because something about it itched at the part of his brain that refused to let go of unsolved puzzles. Walt worked quietly, away from the noise, sifting through discarded tips and forgotten leads. He started with phone records, knowing that in any vanishing, the last communication was the thread that either unraveled everything or knotted it beyond repair. That's how he found it, a single outgoing call made from a landline tied to Thomas's office voicemail, placed on the night of his disappearance at exactly 9:03 p.m. The recipient, a public payphone on the east bank of the Salo River, an isolated stretch of town known more for abandoned warehouses than conversations. Walt drove out there, the cold wind slicing off the water and whistling through the dry grass. The booth still stood, rusting at the hinges, plastic windows clouded and cracked, but the number matched. Someone, maybe Thomas, had called it, or been there to answer. Either way, that location now mattered. He ran the booth's call history from that day. Only 2 other calls were made before and after Thomas's timestamp. One was to a law office in Sacramento, now closed. The other, an untraceable burner, no longer in service. Walt filed the information with Hanlon, who stared at the report like it was a ghost reaching out from the grave. It didn't make sense. Why would Thomas leave the courthouse, disappear for hours, then call a payphone near a dead river, unless he wasn't alone? Unless someone else answered that phone, and that someone was waiting. While Hanlon re-examined surveillance from the courthouse garage, another development hit from the shadows. Paul Whitmore, the longtime night watchman at the courthouse building, was found dead at the base of the maintenance stairwell, behind the West Annex. The official cause, cracked skull. Died instantly. A tragedy, they said. But Hanlon's gut clenched the moment he heard. Just 2 days earlier, Whitmore had agreed to speak to a local journalist about what he heard the night Thomas vanished. Not saw, heard. The journalist, Melinda Ross, confirmed it. "He told me he heard shouting in the basement hallway," Elle said. "Said it sounded like Thomas was arguing with someone. He couldn't make out the words, but swore it wasn't a normal conversation. Something about the tone. It scared him." Hanlon asked what time it was, She said Whitmore guessed around 8:45 p.m. right in the missing 6-minute surveillance window. But now Whitmore was gone. Just like that. Security logs from that night confirmed Whitmore had clocked in at 8:01 p.m. He made regular rounds, elevators, courtrooms, mechanical room, everything was logged. Except at 8:44 p.m., the system noted a temporary loss of motion sensor activity on the basement level. For precisely 7 minutes, nothing in the file suggested a technical failure. It's simply blank. Melinda's story never made it to print. Her editor at the Chronicle pulled it hours before publishing, citing lack of verification and legal concerns. She didn't buy it. Neither did Hanlon, but there was nothing to push back with. No source, no backup, just a dead man and the echo of a conversation never fully heard. Walt Durning continued digging. He retraced Thomas's path that day, interviews, lunch spot, dry cleaner, and found something strange. At 2:12 p.m., Thomas had briefly visited a small electronics repair shop 3 blocks from the courthouse. He spoke to the owner, left after 6 minutes. No one had recorded this visit before. The shop owner, a thin man with nicotine fingers and a nervous tic, remembered Thomas only because he wanted to know if I could block GPS signals from a phone, the man said. Said it was a legal hypothetical, but his hands were shaking. I told him no. He left. Walt asked if Thomas bought anything. The man nodded. A small recorder, pocket size, paid cash. A recorder, a man under pressure. A sudden disalignment. Maybe Thomas didn't vanish without a trace. Maybe he left one, just small enough to be overlooked. Hanlon called Irene that evening. She sat silently as he recounted the payphone, the recorder, the death of the watchman. Her eyes didn't blink. When he mentioned the basement, she whispered, he hated that part of the building, said it gave him a bad feeling, like something was rotting behind the walls. Hanlon asked if Thomas had ever mentioned names. She shook her head, except one time, weeks before the trial began, Thomas came home pale and quiet. She asked what was wrong. He only said, they buried something under this whole damn city, Irene, and it's starting to leak. Hanlon hung up the phone with his thoughts spinning. Something's leaking, he repeated to himself. Maybe Thomas had stumbled on more than corruption. Maybe it wasn't just legal. Maybe it was physical, tangible, hidden somewhere nobody wanted found. The river, the recorder, the erased footage. And now, the first body. 2 years had passed since Thomas Weller vanished, and for most of San Rafael, the case had dissolved into local myth. A cautionary tale, a sad story buried under newer headlines. The courthouse buzzed with new trials, new scandals, and newer attorneys trying to carve their names into the granite walls Thomas once walked beside. But behind the echo of closing doors and rustling suits, pieces still shifted in the dark. Irene Weller had long since stopped giving interviews. She rarely left the house, save for Sunday trips to the cemetery, even though her husband had no grave. Detective Hanlon had been reassigned to another department. Walt Durning, the PI, took on fewer and fewer clients. Yet something still lingered, unsettled, incomplete. It was during a rainy January morning when it resurfaced, not with a bang but with a whisper. Carol Laughlin, a former court records clerk, went public after being terminated for reasons she claimed were manufactured retaliation. She contacted a small independent podcast that specialized in cold cases and conspiracies, and in a low-quality recording made in a motel room just off Highway 101, she dropped a revelation no one saw coming. 2 days before Weller's disappearance, she said, his entire case file vanished from the archive system. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but the words were clear. It was gone. No digital version, no hard copy. I thought it was just a system bug at first. I reported it. The next morning, the file was still missing. Then, 2 days later, it was back. Same file name, same timestamp. But it wasn't the same file. The podcast host, startled, pressed her. What do you mean? Kara hesitated, then said, some of the documents were reordered. One deposition, marked confidential, was no longer included, and there was a new signature on the filing index, a name I'd never seen before. It was faint, smudged. Looked like L.Ev, she paused again. I wasn't supposed to say anything, but I kept a screenshot before it re-uploaded. She provided it. The show's website posted it the next day. The photo was blurry, grainy, but real. A digital record of Thomas's court file, temporarily deleted and mysteriously reinserted. The signature in the lower corner could have said Leon Vega, or something close to it. The name meant nothing to the average viewer, but Hanlon, listening in his car on his day off, gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew that name. Not from a file, not from any official record. From a whisper Irene had once recounted, from a single note scribbled in the margin of a copied deposition in red ink. Leon Vega. Hanlon reopened his personal notes, tucked away in his garage, pages spread out across a dusty workbench. The same name showed up 3 times, in different contexts, none directly tied to Thomas. Vega wasn't a witness, not listed among the defendants or clients, but each time he appeared, it was like a shadow pressed just outside the spotlight. Unmentioned officially, known only to those who dared to acknowledge the case, was larger than it appeared. The same week Kara's podcast aired, Melinda Ross, the journalist who once tried to publish the story about the courthouse night guard's mysterious death, received a phone call from a blocked number. A male voice said only one thing before hanging up. "Stop chasing ghosts, Melinda. Vega's not your story." That was enough for her to call Hanlon, breaking a silence neither had breached in over a year. "He's real," she told him. "I think they're still watching." Hanlon, though off the force, decided to return to the courthouse archives unofficially. He visited an old contact, Edward Lynn, a quiet, nervous IT administrator who had once slipped him system logs off the record. Hanlon asked about the deleted file, if there was a record of who had access during that window. Lynn hesitated, then admitted he'd been told never to search that period again. "It's flagged," he said. "A red assistant block. Federal clearance." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Since when do county court records require federal oversight?" Lynn shrugged, then whispered, "Since the morning after Weller went missing." The next day, Hanlon met Walt Durning at their usual diner. He handed him a printout of the podcast transcript, circled the LV signature. Walt leaned back in his booth seat and muttered, "I've heard that name before." He pulled a worn leather notebook from his coat and flipped through pages stained with coffee and years of scribbled notes. He stopped at a page dated 1985. Westridge Holdings v. Gomez Construction. Plaintiff witness, Leon Vega. Marked confidential. Testimony never entered into record. Walt looked up, his brow furrowed. He was the guy who knew about the shell companies, offshore accounts. He came forward, then disappeared 3 weeks after the hearing. Hanlon stared. "And nobody followed up?" Walt shook his head. "They said he had mental health issues, unreliable." Story buried. Later that week, a retired courthouse janitor, Edgar Penrose, now living in assisted care, agreed to speak with Hanlon under one condition: no recordings. Over cups of lukewarm tea, he confessed he'd seen a man in the basement hallway the night Thomas disappeared. Not Thomas, someone else. Tall, heavy coat, not from here, foreign accident, maybe Spanish. He said he was there for a documented intercept. I thought he was with the legal team. Hanlon leaned in. Did he give a name? Edgar frowned. He said it under his breath once. Vega. I remember because he corrected me when I said Vega. Said no S, just Vega. The pieces began forming something sinister. A forgotten witness, a court file erased and returned, a presence in the basement the night Thomas disappeared, and a name that floated in and out of the record like a ghost, Leon Vega. Irene, when informed, said only one thing. That name was in one of the dreams I had the night Thomas went missing. He kept whispering it, over and over. I didn't know it was real. Hanlon stared at his wall of notes that night. The timeline was broken, full of cracks. But if Vega was a thread, if he had resurfaced even as a name buried in a podcast, then maybe. The summer of 2000 arrived in Marin County with its usual dry heat and golden afternoons. On the southern base of Mount Tamalpais, the trails were littered with dry pine needles, cicadas buzzed like electric wires, and the forest smelled of sun-baked soil and old bark. It was here, on a day like any other, that 3 boys from a nearby neighborhood decided to go exploring. They were only 13, Leo, Mateo, and Josh, armed with nothing more than backpacks stuffed with snacks, a cheap compass, and the kind of invincibility only youth can feel. They ventured past the known trails, eager to find something cool, like an old den, a forgotten trail, or even a snake skeleton. But what they found instead would reawaken a mystery long buried. As they stepped deeper into the shaded undergrowth, Mateo tripped on a root and landed hard beside a moss-covered fallen tree. "Hey," he shouted, rubbing his shin. "Something sharp's down here." Curious, Leo knelt beside him and started pulling away clumps of moss and brittle branches. That's when they saw the corner of something metallic, just a glint of silver in the dirt. Josh helped dig around it, and within minutes they had unearthed a small, moldy leather wallet with a tarnished clasp. It was water-damaged, the stitching fraying, but still intact. Leo opened it first, expecting maybe old coins or a forgotten ID. What he found instead was a cracked plastic card bearing the name Thomas R. Weller, Attorney at Law. The photo was faded, but the resemblance to the images that once filled newspapers still clung to the surface. Beneath the card was a pair of broken wire-rimmed glasses, one lens completely shattered, and, tucked behind a slit in the lining, wrapped in a small waxy sheet, was a folded map. The map was a standard trail map of Mount Tamalpais, but one section had been circled in black ink. A handwritten X marked a clearing near the edge of what locals called the Ridgewood Grove, a less traveled part of the forest known for dense underbrush and old wooden structures from the 1970s logging operations. The boys had never heard of Ridgewood, but the implication was too exciting to ignore. They argued for a minute about whether to go or turn back, but curiosity won. It always does. They arrived at the spot an hour later, their water bottles nearly empty, their sun casting long shadows between the trees. At the center of the clearing was a squat wooden structure, half sunken into the earth, its roof collapsed in places, walls stained with mildew. There were no signs, no padlocks, nothing official. The boys peered through a broken window, saw empty shelves and what looked like a rusted metal cabinet. They didn't go inside. Instead, Josh took photos with his disposable camera of the wallet, the card, the glasses, and the building. They left everything as it was, unsure whether they'd found something dangerous or just weird. Josh's older brother, Evan, happened to be a journalism student home for the summer. When he developed the film and saw the name Thomas R. Weller, he froze. He remembered the stories, the missing posters, the late-night broadcasts. He told his father, who told the sheriff, and within 48 hours the FBI was back in Marin County. The area was cordoned off. Forensics teams descended on the Ridgewood site with sonar off, dogs, and shovels. The wallet was confirmed to be authentic. The ID card matched Thomas's original license number. The glasses were consistent with the prescription found in his medical records. But what disturbed everyone most wasn't what they found. It was how long it had remained untouched. The soil around the wallet showed no signs of recent disturbance, no signs of being buried or planted. It had been there, quietly decaying beneath the forest canopy, for years. Inside the abandoned shed, investigators found little of substance. Most of the furniture had rotted. The metal cabinet was empty, save for a spider colony and a rusted screwdriver. But in a narrow crawl space beneath a loose floorboard, one agent discovered something odd. A piece of fabric, a torn strip of suit material, high quill wool, navy in color, stained at the edge with what would later test positive as dried blood. The pattern of the tear suggested it had caught on something sharp. They bagged it, tagged it, and added it to the mounting pile of unresolved fragments. Detective Hanlon was called back for consultation. Though no longer active, he stood at the forest's edge as technicians swept the area. "Why here?" he asked aloud. "Why leave pieces of him scattered across time, like this?" No one had answers. But the map, the X, the wallet, these were not accidents. Someone had marked this spot. Either Thomas himself or someone who wanted him found. When Hanlon met with Irene later that week, he presented the items carefully, placing the cracked glasses in her palm. Her fingers trembled as she held them. "These were his," she whispered, as if speaking to the past. "He only wore this kind of frame, said it made him look more serious in court." Hanlon laid out the map and pointed to the X. Irene didn't recognize the handwriting, but she nodded slowly. Thomas hated the woods, always said the quiet made him anxious. If he went there, he wasn't alone. The media caught wind of the discovery within days. Old headlines were revived, theories reprinted, and amateur sleuths flooded online forums with speculation. Had Thomas been taken there against his will? Was the map his own, a final attempt to leave a trail, or had someone else drawn the X, leading searchers into a false narrative? Back in the forensic lab, technicians uncovered another detail. Beneath the black ink that marked the X on the map, when viewed under UV light, was faint red writing. A date, September 12, 93, the exact date Thomas vanished. And next to it, in the same faded ink, two initials. The discovery at Ridgewood Grove turned the air electric. Within 48 hours of the boys' report, the Maryland County Sheriff's Office launched a full-scale forensic sweep of the decrepit wooden shed. The structure, sinking into the forest floor and blanketed in ivy, hadn't seen human entry in decades, yet there was an undeniable sense that it had been waiting, holding something just out of reach. Every creak of the rotting wood beneath boots, every shift in filtered light through broken beams, felt like the whisper of history resurfacing. The search team, equipped with LED flashlights, fiber optic scopes, and geophones, fanned out across the floorboards, combing the understructure and wall cavities for signs of human presence, or worse, remains. But what they found instead was something smaller, older, yet just as damning. In a narrow wall void behind what had once been a shelving unit, a technician's gloved hand brushed against something smooth and rectangular. A Sony microcassette recorder, its plastic faded and scuffed, the label on its side barely legible. It was a model discontinued in the early 990s, which meant it likely hadn't been used, or even touched, since shortly after Thomas Weller's disappearance. Carefully, they bagged it, tagged it, and sent it to the tech lab. When the team powered it up in a soundproof room back at headquarters, the reel inside still turned. The first few seconds were nothing but white noise, crackling static, and a low humming feedback that made the technician flinch. Then, at the 14th second mark, a voice emerged, dry, deliberate, unmistakably male. If you're hearing this, then I've disappeared, or worse. And if that's the case, then the only thing that matters is what happened on September 8th. The voice paused, a shuffling sound of paper or clothing audible. Find the man sitting in the last row. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he was. I saw him. He saw me. The message cut off abruptly, followed by a faint scraping noise, as if the recorder had been hidden in haste. Hanlon, who had been called back to assist, listened to the tape 4 times in a row. The voice was familiar, bearing the cadence and tone he remembered from courtroom recordings. It was Thomas. And he hadn't just been afraid. He'd known something. He'd left a breadcrumb, naming no names, but pointing to someone specific, the man in the back row during the final court session Thomas attended before he vanished. A man not listed among the attendees, not subpoenaed, not scheduled. They pulled the court transcript from September 8, 1993. Attendance logs, security camera stills, and seating charts, some of which were incomplete or partially redacted. But one photo, taken by a local paper covering the hearing, showed the courtroom just before recess. On the far right corner, in the final row, was a man wearing a gray blazer, head bowed, a notebook balanced on one knee. His face was partially obscured by another spectator. He wasn't identified in the caption. A zoom on the original print revealed no visible badge or pass. No press tag, no affiliation. Walt Durning took one look at the image and murmured, "That's him." Hanlon turned. "You know him?" Walt nodded slowly. "I've seen him before, 1985. Westridge case? That's Vega." The name hit the room like a dropped gun. Hanlon cross-checked the images with old DMV files and facial recognition databases, but nothing returned. No match. No name. Whoever the man was, he didn't exist, at least not officially. But what twisted the knife deeper was this. The man had been found dead 3 days after the September 8th hearing, a fiery single-car crash on Highway 101 just south of Novato. No foul play suspected at the time. The driver's identity was recorded as unconfirmed male, mid-40s SUV with no license or ID found in the vehicle, which had burned beyond recognition. Dental records were never obtained. The body had been cremated as a John Doe. Hanlon's fingers tightened around the edge of the table as he read the old report. No identification, no family, no follow-up. Convenient. Too convenient. If that man was Vega or someone connected to him, then Thomas hadn't just vanished. He'd been silenced because he had pointed at something, at someone that wasn't meant to be seen. The question now was not just who Vega was, but who had covered for him. and how deep the deception ran. Meanwhile, Irene, still reeling from the rediscovered glasses and map, listened to the recording in private. When the voice crackled to life and said, "If I've disappeared," she turned pale. She clutched the player in both hands, tears spilling from her eyes. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew they'd come for him." She played it again, rewinding, as if hoping to hear something new the second time. But each repetition only hardened the reality. Thomas had tried to leave a trail. Back at the sheriff's department, the technician working the recorder found one final detail, a short, encrypted audio segment tagged at the end of the tape, recorded in a second track. When analyzed through decryption software, the segment revealed a background audio snippet, faint voices in a hallway, distorted but discernible. One voice said, "He's going to expose it." Another replied, "Then he won't make it to trial." The rest was muffled. Haneland stood before the whiteboard, now repopulated with photos, dates, fragments of Thomas's handwriting, the name Vega scrawled in red ink. He added a new note below the image of the man in the courtroom, witness or executioner. It was unclear whether the man in the back row had been there to watch, or to ensure that Thomas never walked out of that courtroom alive. 4 weeks passed after the discovery of the recorder, but the case refused to fade back into shadow. The story of the Ridgewood map, the glasses, and the cryptic voice on the tape had reignited national interest, with true crime podcasts dissecting each detail and local forums resurrecting theories once dismissed as fringe. Thomas Weller was no longer just a vanished attorney. He had become something larger, a symbol of hidden truth, a man lost to forces no one dared name. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning in October, something else happened, something that cracked the silence wide open again. It was 7:42 a.m. when the morning segment of KMRN 96.3, a modest but well-respected local radio station, took an unscheduled call. The host, John Carpenter, known for his dry wit and offbeat interviews, paused mid-sentence as the producer signaled from behind the glass. "We've got someone on line 4, the producer mouthed. "We've got someone on line 4, the producer mouthed. "KMRN, you're live on the air," he said. There was static at first, a hollow crackle, followed by a low voice, calm, male, unshaken. "Thomas Weller is alive," the caller said. Carpenter blinked. "Excuse me?" he asked. "You said—" The voice continued, firmer this time. "He didn't disappear, he escaped. He saw something in that case he wasn't supposed to. He knew they were watching. That map? He left it. The wallet? It was planted, but not by him. They're trying to send a message." Carpenter leaned forward, motioning for the producer to start recording. "Who's they?" he asked, but the caller had already hung up. Within hours, the clip was circulating online. Reddit threads speculated wildly. Some claimed the voice was synthetic, AI-generated. Others swore it matched an old voicemail Thomas had left years prior to his disappearances. But the FBI requested a copy, and local police began tracing the call. It had been routed through a series of relays, including a long-functed hospital line in Nevada. Whoever made the call didn't want to be found. At the same time, the forensics report on the wallet surfaced. Hanlon, now operating under official reactivation due to the renewed federal interest, received the report in his inbox under the subject line, "Contamination unlikely. Latent prints confirmed." The wallet, long believed to be Thomas's, bore 2 sets of fingerprints. One partial match belonged to Irene Weller, expected given she had handled the item at the station. The other, previously unidentified, had been run through national databases. The match that returned stunned everyone. It belonged to one Samuel Frayne, a construction contractor from Los Angeles, presumed dead in 1989 following a well-documented train collision in Monterey County. His body had reportedly been found among the wreckage, burned beyond recognition, and identified via personal effects and dental records. But now, his fingerprints were on an item unearthed in 2000, an item believed to have been untouched for at least 7 years. Hanlon's immediate reaction was to question the validity of the 1989 identification. He contacted the coroner's office responsible for Frayne's postmortem and learned that the original dental records had been misplaced and that the body had been cremated within 72 hours of recovery. Walt Durning, already growing uneasy with the trajectory of the case, pointed out something chilling. If Frayne wasn't in that coffin, then who was? And where has he been for 11 years? Irene, upon hearing the name, looked distant. "I don't know a Samuel Frayne," she said, "but I remember one night, months before Thomas vanished, he came home and said, 'If I ever end up like that contractor in Monterey, don't believe a word of it.'" I thought he was being dramatic. Hanlon nodded slowly. He wasn't. These theories multiplied. One suggested that Frayne had gone into hiding in exchange for testimony against Westridge Holdings. Another floated the idea that Frayne and Thomas had crossed paths, two men caught in the same net of silenced witnesses and vanished names. But most alarming was the implication behind the fingerprints. The wallet had not been hidden by Thomas. It had been planted, perhaps as bait, perhaps as a warning, and whoever placed it had access to the remains, or the legend, of a man already declared dead. Investigators returned to Ridgewood with renewed urgency. Soil samples around the wallet's resting place were re-examined. Traces of skin oil and organic residue suggested it had been handled and placed there no more than 3 years prior, circa 1997, long after Thomas's disappearance. So why had it taken until 2000 for it to be found? Had it been moved again? Or had it simply been waiting to be stumbled upon by the right people? Children too young to connect the dots, but curious enough to act. Meanwhile, digital voice analysts reviewed the radio call. The pitch, cadence, and timbre were consistent with a mid-40s male, likely unaltered. One software used by law enforcement for counterterrorism analysis returned a partial match, not to Thomas Weller, but to someone once recorded in the background of a deposition related to the 1985 Vega case. A bystander, unnamed, unidentified. Hanlon began charting the overlaps. Thomas, Vega, Frayne, the 1985 Westridge suit, the train accident, the court in 1993. The timeline was no longer linear. It spiraled inward, tangled like vines around a secret meant never to be found. Each time they believed they'd uncovered the final piece, another shifted in from the shadows. Irene, growing increasingly withdrawn, began keeping a journal, filling pages with dreams, impressions, faces she swore she'd seen watching her from crowds. "They're not finished," she wrote one night. "Not with Thomas. Not with me." By November of 2000, the weight of the case had begun to settle once again, this time heavier, more suffocating, like damp soil layered over a coffin that no one had dared open. Hanlon continued his private investigation, off the books but supported by a quiet network of allies and a slowly growing archive of unexplained evidence. Irene, however, had withdrawn into something quieter, something more internal. Each new piece of information no longer brought clarity, only a different shade of fear. The photograph of the back row man, the voice on the tape, the planted wallet, the fingerprints of a man officially dead 11 years prior, all of it blurred the line between what was real and what was orchestrated. And then came the discovery that would twist the knife further, not with violence, but with words, carefully chosen, intentionally hidden, and left behind like a final whisper. It happened one Sunday afternoon as Irene sorted through Thomas's remaining belongings. She had developed the quiet ritual of revisiting old items, not in mourning, but in search. She believed, or perhaps hoped, that Thomas had left more than what had been found, that he, knowing his time was short, had prepared something. A code, a clue, a goodbye. On that day, her hands paused on a velvet-lined box tucked at the back of his. Inside was a pocket watch, one she had seen him carry occasionally but never paid attention to. It was old, gold-plated, and engraved with a Latin phrase she had never translated. What caught her eye now, after all these years, was a tiny notch along the rim that she had never noticed. She pried gently when pressed. She pried gently, heart racing, and the backplate popped open with a faint metallic sigh. Inside was no mechanism. Instead, there was a tightly folded slip of aged paper, no bigger than a postage stamp. She unfolded it carefully. To her eyes, the paper was blank, nothing but fibers and a faint scent of smoke. Confused, but unwilling to dismiss it, she recalled a conversation with Thomas years ago, when he'd jokingly mentioned invisible ink, how some espionage cases used UV-reacted fixtures. Her breath quickened. She retrieved a UV pen light from a drawer, one she had bought for a crossword hobby. When she held the beam over the note, letters bled into existence like ghosts drawn from the dark. The message was simple, sparse, terrifying. If you've found this, it means I've failed to stop them. I've been forced to disappear. There is someone who must be protected. They're watching both of us. Don't search for me. It will only lead them to you. The moment Irene read the final initial, her knees buckled. She sat hard on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in her hand, the glow of the UV light pulsing against her skin. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't rumor or speculation. It was real. Her husband had known he was being followed, watched, hunted. He had chosen silence over exposure, and worse, he had implied there was someone else involved, someone worth vanishing for. But who? She read it again. There is someone who must be protected. Her first thought, irrational and instinctive, was of herself. Had he left to protect her? But then she remembered something she hadn't thought of in years. In the final weeks before Thomas's disappearance, he had started receiving letters. Handwritten, delivered without stamps. Always burned after meeting, she'd smiled and said, "Old ghosts writing love notes." She had laughed. He hadn't. Hanlon arrived within the hour after she called. She handed him the note, the UV light, the watch. He didn't say anything for several minutes, just sat beside her on the sofa and read the message 3 times. "This changes things," he said at last. His voice means he wasn't just hiding from danger, he was trying to redirect it. He stood, pacing. Someone close to him, maybe even a minor, was in danger too. And if that person was discovered? He trailed off, looking to the wall, then to the fireplace, where an old photograph of Thomas with his law school classmates still sat. Irene followed his gaze. "He had a brother," she said slowly. "Much younger, estranged. They hadn't spoken in years. Thomas said he was a mess. Addicted, paranoid, said he used to call in the middle of the night, mumbling about being chased. I dismissed it. Thought it was just family drama." Hanlon blinked. "Name?" She shook her head. "I never met him, never even saw a picture." The letter opened a door. If Thomas had sacrificed himself to shield another, this brother, or someone else entirely, then the original case was no longer just about disappearance. It was about containment, control, sacrifice. Hanlon added the note to the growing case file, scanning it under every spectrum he had access to. No additional messages emerged, just that one chilling directive: don't search for me. Meanwhile, the radio station that had received the anonymous call reported another strange event. Their backup servers, housed in a private data facility, had been breached remotely. Only one file was accessed, the audio recording of the mysterious caller. It had been copied and re-encrypted with a signature key belonging to a Fuximitous technology. The firm had folded in 1994 following a scandal involving unauthorized surveillance. No official records of their employees remained, but one name surfaced in the metadata of the copied file: S. Frayne. Hanlon stared at the screen in disbelief. Was Frayne still alive? Was he connected not just to the wallet, but now to the orchestration of misinformation? Harold, reading over his shoulder, whispered, "He's not protecting himself. He's protecting something bigger. Someone who hasn't been found yet." Jean-Claude nodded, then slowly added a new note under the growing diagram on his wall. It read, "Letter confirms deliberate disappearances. Motive, protection. Identity of third party, unknown. Status of Thomas, possibly alive." A month had passed since Irene discovered Thomas's final invisible letter confession, and its echoes continued to unravel the case's fog of uncertainty. Detective Hanlon had pieced together enough to suspect that whatever Thomas had uncovered likely extended far beyond a single missing attorney. He had prepared to meet with Irene to go over new lines of inquiry, but before that could happen, another thread pulled the investigation into a deeper labyrinth. That morning, local headlines screamed of an unexpected announcement. Leonard Harris, once Thomas Weller's longtime secretary and confidant, had stepped down as CEO of Landmark Properties, one of California's largest real estate firms, effective immediately. Harris had been the architect behind the company's dramatic expansion, but no one expected his sudden resignation. Journalists called for interviews. Even Landmark's PR team went silent. It was as if Leonard Harris had evaporated overnight. Harlan, who had been reviewing the latest forensic data, froze at the news. He remembered that Kerr Laughlin had mentioned a removal order on certain documents linking Harris to a name that had surfaced only once before. Could this be the same Vega that kept haunting the edges of Thomas's file? But that was speculation. Hanlon needed facts. He obtained court filings, financial statements, and tax reports tied to landmark properties during Harris's tenure. What he found was astonishing. Offshore wire transfers to entities that didn't exist. Accounts under names that flagged back to the deceased people connected to the Frayne fingerprint, the Vega case, and yes, Thomas himself. Some transfers referenced shell companies registered under the names of deceased individuals, tied to property holdings and classified accounts. In one instance, Harris wired $50,000, 0 cents, from a landmark account to RR, the initials of a man whose obituary had been published 9 years earlier. There were other payments too, small, concealed, but clearly set up to disappear with whoever controlled them. When Hanlon confronted lawyers representing Landmark, they raised legal shields. The money transfers, they said, were part of legitimate tax-advantaged corporate strategies. But Harris's departure and the accompanying erasure of his public presence made no sense if he was just another executive stepping back. Someone was cleaning house. The archives he controlled were vanishing. Emails, memos, ledgers all disappeared, leaving behind only digital echoes and empty folders. The pressure statements had been wiped just days after Irene found the invisible letter. Then, 4 weeks later, the Marin Times got an unexpected delivery. A small, worn, leather-bound notebook was thrown through the side window of their newsroom at 2 a.m., landing in a puddle of rainwater beside the editor's desk. The notebook was stamped with the initials TW on the front cover, pressed into the leather, faded but visible. No envelope, no return address, no note, just a booklet that shook every step of Hanlon's construction of the case. The editor turned it over to Hanlon personally. Its pages were covered in near microscopic writing. Dates, times, locations, and terse notes, mostly logistics, but occasionally annotations that signaled fear. There were maps, phone numbers that didn't exist, references to safe houses. Entries like 8/8 court, must contact him, report next week. Some entries were coded, others underlined. Leon will send. Bringo Simo at dawn. Flashback sound. The writing matched the style of Thomas's notes, crowded margins, scratchy letters, but it was unmistakably newer. Maybe 199820000. Whoever had written this had been living, breathing. TW was not dead. He was moving, even while missing. Handwriting analysts hired by the FBI noted similarities to Thomas's handwriting, but with a contemplative slant, as if the writer was cautious but trained. The word escape appeared multiple times, scribbled out and rewritten. Underlines marked "Protect Her" next to something that looked like Irene's signature. Initialed I, but they cautioned that the contents could just as easily come from someone else, an accomplice, a false lead, or a deeply knowledgeable imposter. The notebook reopened speculation. Could Thomas have faked his death and lived in hiding, writing this to document his flight and protect someone else? Or was it a mocking echo? Someone else with access to his handwriting and psychological profile, setting a trap for those searching. Landmark's properties and Leonard Harris's departure added more pieces to a puzzle that glowed with corporate scale. The missing files, the sudden resignations, the shell accounts, all pointed to a systemic cover-up that had been active since before Thomas stepped in. Irania, now fragile but determined, went over each page. On one entry, she recognized a phrase Thomas had said at dinner once. "I'll leave a trail, just in case." She thought she read it here. Tears welled. Was it him, or someone mimicking him? Hanlon looked at the page with "Protector" and asked, "You?" Irene shook her head. "No, but he might have meant me," she paused, "or someone else." He didn't reply. The notebook dangled between them like a ghost, tethered to the missing attorney's name. The marred handwriting and logistics suggested the author had been constantly on the move, living with purpose and dread. If this was Thomas, he had run for 7 years. If it wasn't, then someone else in his inner circle may have taken over the protective mission, someone fearful of the same looming threat. Perhaps Leonard Harris had done that, perhaps that was why he disappeared now. Hanlon looked at the final entry in the notebook, written in heavy black ink. Last stop, Novato. Wait for signal. Beneath it, a scrawled circle around November 30th, 0. That date hadn't happened yet. The notebook had predicted something. Whether it had happened or not was unclear. The network of silence surrounding Thomas Weller was no longer just quiet. It was orchestrated. Harris wasn't the only one who walked away. Someone, maybe many, had decided to let Thomas go, but at what cost? Iranian Hanlon stared at the lines. Protect her. Protect her from whom? From the Westridge network? From a man named Vega? Or from the shadow once called Samuel Frayne? The questions had multiplied far beyond what any missing person case should contain. On December 31, 2000, the final vestige of a year-long mystery drew its breath in silence and fog. The Marin County Cemetery sat draped in cold mist as funeral wreaths lay scattered by headstones. It was New Year's Eve, but there was no festive air, only the hush of winter and the low hum of distant traffic. The cemetery's cameras captured the lone figure of an elderly man standing before a simple grave, marked Margaret Weller, beloved mother. He wore a threadbare trench coat, glasses with round lenses, and carried an old leather satchel that matched the style of the wallet found in Ridgewood Grove. His hair was silver, his stance unsteady but determined. Detective Hanlon, who had been monitoring the cemetery after a tip from an anonymous source, stayed hidden in his patrol car. He recognized the figure immediately, not as Thomas, but as someone who resembled him closely enough to raise questions. The man remained for 20 minutes, motionless, head bowed. At one point he brushed his hand across the gravestone, then sat on a nearby bench, gazing at it through cracks in the fog. The station transmitted grainy footage to a waiting mobile unit. As the man rose and began walking toward the exit, the officers moved in. They hesitated as he crossed the threshold of their flashlights. The man paused and stared back, his face obscured by mist, lips moving but words unheard. He had the same mannerisms as Thomas, the tilt of the head, the tightened shoulders. Then he turned and disappeared among tall pines at the far edge of the cemetery. Officers pursued, their footsteps swallowed by mist. By the time they exited onto the trail at Ridgewood's boundary, a place marked with the same X from the boy's map, the man had vanished entirely. Hanlon, helmeted and breath visible in the cold air, spoke into the radio. He's gone. No sign, just footprints leading into the forest, then nothing. The fog rolled in, thick and white, obscuring the searchlights. Behind them, the silent echo of a single gravel crunch faded until all that remained was the forest's hush, until all that remained was the same place where those 3 boys had found the wallet and glasses 10 months prior. By morning, more cameras reviewed, more footprints traced, but no sighting, no satchel, no trench coat. It was as if the earth had swallowed him. The cemetery logged only ghost images, an imprint where a man appeared for a moment, then dissolved into mist. The grave remained undisturbed, the wreaths untouched, and beneath them Margaret Weller's grave, overgrown with late winter moss, held only shadows. In the days that followed, KMRN received another anonymous tip. You saw him. Now remember, he watches you. The station dismissed it as hoax, yet Hanlon filed it in his case folder under active. The Marin Times published a front-page editorial, "The Cemetery Visitor, Final Clue or Final Mirage?" Social media speculated wildly. Had Thomas returned to mourn, or had someone else, his brother, a surrogate, come in his place? The glasses found near the trailhead were confirmed to be wire rim style, unused, possibly dropped. No prints, no trace. Irene read the report with trembling hands. The handwriting analyst compared the wafer-thin scrap of writing beneath the sunlit note on her dresser. She stared at the figure in the image, his face blurred and gray, wondering if it was Thomas, or someone deliberately mimicking him. She drove to the cemetery one morning, found soil-disturbed footprints leading into the forest's edge, and sat by her car, listening to wind whisper through the pines. She didn't cry. She whispered, "He's still out there." Hanlon closed the official report with no definitive conclusion. Cause: unidentified person matching description of Weller, visited cemetery, person disappeared thereafter, no evidence of death or survival. Case remains open. In his personal notes, on his wall covered in photos, maps, and cryptic journal entries, he added one word beneath a printed image of the cemetery footage: alive. As January dawned, the mist lingered low in the morning valleys, refusing to lift. The place remained quiet, but every so often, hikers reported seeing an old man at the forest's edge, staring at them, then turning and vanishing. The Ridgewood Trail stayed closed for safety, though officially officers saw nothing. The notebook found at the Marin Times remained their only tangible artifact, the last breadcrumb from the missing man known as T.W. Its last dated entry was November 30, 2000. Last stop, Novato, of a signal. Whether the cemetery visit had been that signal, no one knew, but signals implied communication, and someone had seen to capture footage. Someone had recognized, and someone had followed. For Iron, life continued in a muted rhythm. She spoke rarely, but each night she dialed Hanlon's number. They didn't talk long. She only said, "He was there," or "He's gone now." He replied, "I know." They left it at that. The shared understanding was enough. He had vanished again. In the broader world, as the new millennium unfurled, the case of Thomas Weller became a true crime legend. Files buried under cold case dust, documentaries never aired, podcasts repeated with sensational waits for closure that never came. And occasionally, on misty evenings, someone would swear they saw a man with round glasses and a leather satchel cross the edge of the tree line, like a living specter reappearing only to vanish again. To this day, no body, no confession, no clear sign of life or death, just questions that breathe in the fog and die when the sun breaks through. The missing attorney's story became a mirror reflecting unfinished endings, an open question echoing in every creak of forest floor and cemetery gate. If this story left you thinking, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing you more untold mysteries. What do you think really happened to Thomas Weller? Do you believe he's still alive? And by the way, where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts and location in the comments. We're reading everything.